All right, for the opening prayer, I wanted to read a poem. This is based on a monk once told Seamus Heaney, one of the many Irish Nobel laureates in literature, to read poems as prayers. And then when Seamus Heaney went to collect his Nobel Prize, he said the function of poetry is to redress the imbalance between heaven and earth. And so I thought this poem was particularly apropos to what we're going to be addressing today. It's by Gerard Manley Hopkins, called God's Grandeur. The world is charged with the grandeur of God. It will flame our like shining from shook foil. It gathers to a greatness like the ooze of oil crushed. Why do men then now not wreck its rod? Generations have trod, and all is seared with trade, bleared, smeared with toil, and wears man's smudge and shares man's smell the soil. Is bare now, nor can feet feel being shod. And for all this, nature is never spent. There lives the dearest freshness deep down things. And though the last lights off the black west went, oh, morning at the brown brink eastward springs, because the Holy Ghost over the bent world breathes with warm breast and with bright wings. So today our forum is really stimulated by the survey where many parishioners felt they wanted to have more of a focus on current events. And I think that one of the missions of these forums is to bring a spiritual focus onto secular issues. And I was brought back to the Episcopal Church as an example of this many years ago, where the rector gave a sermon, and it was at the time of the Lewinsky and Clinton scandal. And the rector said, there are many people to judge Clinton. It's our job to forgive him. And I thought, well, that's an important role for the church. And as many of you may know, in Hyde Park on Sunday mornings, they have a speaker's corner. And so people get up and give their opinions on their soapbox about what's going on in the world. At least from what I've heard, though, it's not always spiritual. But Hyde Park is near and dear to me because my ancestors used to own Hyde Park, but they were very poor farmers and they had to sell it to the crown. So I thought it would be worthwhile to try to have a sort of Hyde Park corner here on Sunday morning, but add a little bit more of the spiritual focus to it. Now, as a model for this, I can't help but go back to Shakespeare. In his play, The Midsummer Night's Dream, the character of Theseus, who is at the beginning of the play, rather a rationalist, but not a very compassionate man. He sends his daughter out into exile. But by the end of the play, he has become more of a spiritual being, as Pierre Teilhard de Chardin says, that we are spiritual beings in search of an earthly existence, not earthly beings in search of a spiritual existence. And so Theseus, in his famous poet's soliloquy, says, the poet's eye glances from heaven to earth and earth to heaven. And as imagination bodies forth, the poet's pen transforms airy nothings into a local habitation and a place. That essentially is the concept of incarnation. And so I think we're all called upon to be like poets, to bring a heavenly perspective onto our earthly existence. The book that we're now reading by Brian Mclaren, Following the Ancient Paths, with the Reverend Carol Worthing, which is excellent, I think emphasizes this point. The first forum that I attended at this church was given by Brian Mclaren. And so I've always been impressed with him. But he talks about, for example, the role of communal prayer in addressing the many drudges of our daily lives and all the ancient, not only communal prayer, but other experiences and rituals where we try to bring the numinous into our daily lives. I think another example of this is George MacDonald, who, when a friend asked him or was complaining how he couldn't get a drawer open, it was stuck, George MacDonald said, well, think of it as a battle between heaven and earth. And, between good and evil. I can relate to this because I was in search of a heavenly experience recently going ice skating, and I sustained a shoulder injury. So trying to open a drawer is particularly challenging. But this, good versus evil reminds us of what St. Paul said in Ephesians 6, that our battle is not against flesh and blood, but against the dark forces of the universe. What Tolkien would call the Black Riders. And again, Mclaren says that, a mushy spirituality is not going to do much against these dark forces. And again, C.S. Lewis says, the problem we have with the devil is that we either give him too much credit or not enough. So, and it reminds us that the Holy Spirit is a unifier, Satan is a divider. So, bearing these cosmic issues in mind when we're dealing with our daily struggles. Now, I was impressed that recently in a forum, the woman who was a Mormon came and said one of the advantages she saw of the Mormon church is that you had to interface with people who were of a different political or philosophical worldview, that you couldn't stay in your own bubble. And so I have to admit that in my bubble, I don't encounter many people who are anti-vaxxers. But recently I went back to Oklahoma to visit my family, and I encountered a woman who felt like she didn't want to take the vaccine because it was going to affect her DNA and her fertility. And so I drew a picture of the cell wall and the DNA, and I showed her, and I kind of compared it to, this may sound like a pretty weak analogy, but your DNA is like in your security box at home, and the virus will break into your home and break into the security box, but the vaccine is like having armed guards around your house. It can't even get into the cell. And she took a picture, but then she said, but I like Trump. And I'm like, well, how does that, I tried to make a point about, this is a public health issue, but I think I ran up against, and I didn't want to bring up the bleach issue. I didn't think that would serve the purpose. And, and there was another man who was the same thing, but I got absolutely nowhere with him. I mean, it was just a dead end. It was like, no, he believes that there were giants before, the word Genesis, between Genesis 1 and 3, there were these giants that ruled the universe. And, I was asking what his source of information was. And, he then talked to me about Arizona and the recount. And so I am still trying to figure out how to bring a more spiritual focus onto these secular issues. So I would like to open it up for people. How do they bring spiritual issues into the current events? And I'm all ears if you've got ideas on how to deal with these kinds of issues. But did you want to add anything?
I was just going to say, although you're talking, of course, about the great classic authors, I currently teach and have taught many times a class on science and science fiction. But of course, although we look about science and in science fiction is really not about science. Science fiction is really the literature of change. It's about the science and technology, just a marker of change and progress and so forth. And so science fiction is the literature that deals with our anxieties of history. The fact that history is dynamic. That's not just something that we read in our textbooks and then never live through. And of course, we're seeing that today, that we are definitely living through history. We have no doubt that we are living through history right now, and we wish we'd have a little bit less of it. So that's sort of what the perspective I'm bringing to it is, how do we deal with our anxieties about these changes with a changing world, the fact that history is dynamic, that we don't know what it's going to be even tomorrow, to say nothing of 10 years or a century from now. So slightly complementary perspectives here, but we want to just give this opportunity for you all to talk about what you're interested in. So we have a hand up. Actually, we have a microphone, if we can pass this back. Can someone can be our ninja, a microphone ninja? Diane, you go.
It's almost like we need a toolbox. There's so many different ways to approach how we can deal with our anxieties. I think maybe you'll talk about some, but the span is great. Meditation, prayer, relying on the Holy Spirit more, talking to each other, trying to reach out to other people, even if we're not sure they're going to listen, because we never know. We never know what. Reading more. I mean, it's a toolbox. So I just wanted to throw that. Only one thing.
Barbara, you have anything to say? You are an expert in psychiatry and stuff like anxieties and stuff.
But I forgot to bring my psychiatric thinking cap. For the age of anxiety, we need to be rooted in God. And I think that's a good analogy about toolboxes and, prayer and meditation and fellowship, and all those are tools to help us deal with that and to help each other out.
Surely someone must have some concern. Diane said she forgot community.
I was just wondering, do most of the people in this room abide by the time frame that by 2030 things will change drastically, and scientists are saying that their timeline might be off, that it'll happen earlier? I think what they're saying is that we're gonna pass a certain point, and then the storms will not give us a break in between. They will continue and continue and continue. And I just wondered if most of you ascribe to that. Thank you.
So you're talking about the tipping point in climate change. Is that what you're referring to, Anita, the tipping point in climate change? Sorry, you didn't say, you just said things were changed. It's like, there's so many things are changing. It's like we're talking politics, we're going to be under a dictatorship or something, I mean, as a physical science, I can talk, and then we can also have people's things. As a physical scientist, although climate change is not my specialty, I know more than you do. Unfortunately, it is a complex system. It is difficult to make a precise prediction about exactly what will happen, exactly when it will happen. But we do know that you can have these different called modes that you can have the climate. And this has been a concern, and I remember discussions of this back in the early 90s, almost 3 decades ago. People talked about this particular possibility that you could have what's called tipping point, where you would shift things that would happen in the climate. One example is we have all these different currents and cycles in the oceans and so forth that help keep Europe warm and so forth. And we know in the past they have changed. It is possible for them to change again due to temperature and changes in water and so forth. So that certainly is a real possibility. People still argue about it. about whether it will happen or at what time scale and so forth. As a scientist, I'm trained to deal with uncertainties and so forth. So I tend to put in a lot of, lawyer language and footnotes and stuff about, exactly when this will happen. Although I would also say, just because you don't know for sure it's, going to happen doesn't mean that we shouldn't take precautions. Otherwise you'd say, well, why should I wear a seatbelt? Because I don't know I'm going to get into an accident, So that's my perspective. But we do know that we do know that adding in carbon dioxide and other things into the atmosphere do retain more heat. We are raising the temperature due to our actions. That's what the Nobel Prize was awarded for recently, at least half of it for that. They're complex systems, so it's hard to say exactly when things are going to happen. For a long time, actually, many skeptics derided this because they were predicting this and it hasn't happened yet. Therefore, we don't think anything's going to happen at all. Well, except for now we're starting to see some extreme weather events. So that's just my spiel. Sorry to do it, but what do people feel about this, or how do people want to respond to this? Or Barbara, do you have anything?
Well, I think it, goes back to the worldview, and rather than seeing us, I think this is brought out by the forums we've had on conservation and nature, that we're part of the world, that we're supposed to be stewards of it. And I'm reminded of the Coleridge's famous the Mariner poem, and in it, the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which really reflects is autobiographical. In the first part of the poem, the mariner is traveling south, and he's got the world view of what we call the instrumental worldview, that nature is there to serve his purposes. He's not part of it, and so he kills the albatross because the albatross isn't giving him good tidings. But then he has a transformative experience. He's struck by light, sort of like St. Paul, and he comes to see that every living creature is valuable. It's the more sacramental view of life. And I think that our culture is pretty much in the instrumental view, that the resources of the world are there for our purposes to develop. And we look at things short term, not at the long term effects. And it's affected by our, philosophy that what can we extract from the world and what can we do for our, short term gain. And it's not, we're stewards, and we're, as pointed out in Genesis. So I think having a more creationist view in that, we're part of the world, and we're, as St. Francis of Assisi had. And I last night heard the production of Emily Dickinson down at the Coronado, which is just excellent. And she seemed to have that view that, her connection with the nature and the world. And so I think the more that we can influence people to think sacramentally rather than instrumentally would be beneficial.
Do any of you have any thing that you want to say about your many anxieties about this? Diana, do you?
Well, I have an obvious perspective since I'm involved with Simpler Living, but that throwing that out community, I think that is so important when we talk about our anxieties. I think we're overwhelmed by the climate crisis, and it's hard to move. It's like we're frozen in place, many of us. So that idea of community, people supporting each other with information, with science, and with opportunities. I'll throw out a little commercial here. Next week, our church will be ringing the bell more than usual, longer than usual, in recognition of the climate crisis, raising the alarm. We'll have a banner that says, "Destroying the earth is not is against our religion." And we will have advocacy opportunities where people can find ways to contact our county board members and our president. And then the next day, there'll be a rally with faiths throughout the county, sharing some concerns and I'm sorry, presenting what we call demands to our county board. So these things are parts of what we can do when we're faced with such concerning realities. It's a global effort and it's called Faiths for Climate Justice.
I mean, part of the problem is it sort of goes back to what Barbara was saying about talking to someone with vaccines and they just blurt out, but I like Trump. The truth is that we're not very good at thinking things rationally. That we tend to think things through emotional narratives. When it comes to climate change, the one I typically hear is I don't want to pay more taxes. I mean, you drill down and it comes to economic concerns. I don't want to pay more taxes or something like that. And so those are the gut responses, and it's very, very hard to get past those. I mean, and you really have to get to those before you can do anything, because if you aren't aware that that's what actually is driving people, there's no way you're going to be able to reach them. Well, but we want the people on Zoom to be able to hear.
A couple of years ago, we were in Washington, D.C. and found ourselves participating in the Science March. And one of our favorite posters that was being carried said, "There is no planet B." And if we kept that thought before us all the time, I think we'd all be a little more careful of our only planet.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I admit I'm actually a little pessimistic about this. I think we're not going to stave it off. I think what's going to happen is exactly what happened with Hurricane Katrina. When Hurricane Katrina happened, people in the administration, and again, don't want to necessarily take pot shots politically, but people in that administration said, how could we possibly have known this was going to happen? Well, and then I would scream at the TV because I had lived in Louisiana. I was in San Diego at the time, but I'd lived in Louisiana. And just 1 year before, when Hurricane Ivan had gone through, you saw the civil engineers on national TV saying, "Whew, that was a close one. If they had just been just a little bit more on target, the levees would have failed." That was 1 year before Katrina. So we had that kind of stuff all the time. I mean, it also happened with Challenger, all this kind of stuff. We have the warnings that say, why didn't anyone tell us? So just be prepared for that when people say, why didn't anyone tell us? More thoughts on climate change, or we can change issues?
Yesterday morning on NPR, there was a Sicilian farmer in Italy talking about his crops were not growing the way they had because now it is becoming tropical in Sicily. And so they have to now change to avocados and other tropical fruits. And this morning in the Richard Rohr contemplative meditation that comes out once every day, he talks about creation, about how if we start and we think about the earth, and it's not the people, but the earth and the rocks and the trees and the flowers and all, and we focus on them and learn to love them, and then take it on further to love our neighbor.
I guess I think it's always worthwhile to try to reach out and be diplomatic. But I have to say, given my own experiences and watching others, I'm getting more to the point of, for example, with the vaccines, I think Biden has done everything he can to try to get people to get vaccinated. And I think what's having to be done is mandating the vaccines. And apparently that's being effective. And I read editorial in the New York Times op-ed the other day. I think it was either Paul Krugman or David Brooks, saying how, like for the climate change, we're just going to have to tax corporations for polluting. I mean, because then it'll be in their interest to not have an oil spill. So it may be time for a tougher approach.
Well, I just want to say something. It's not that I'm expert in climate change and anything, or science and fictions. But I think there's several things. I felt the society oftentimes does not take its issues serious until it hit us. So that's a kind of problem. It's a fundamental problem. It's like you have a headache and then you go to treat a headache, but we never ask the sources of the headache. And I think the anxiety issue you was bringing up, I just wonder, what do you mean by anxiety? I know we are talking about climate, but there are also a lot of, do we identify the sources of anxiety? Is that internal or external, or is it individual or collective, or the whole society or whole world? And I just actually want to respond to what Connie say something earlier that she heard from the NPR, all those things, and we have the tree plants. And I don't know how much you aware of, I know a lot of us is vegetarian here, but one of the world people was praised about Kobe beef in Japan because they treat the cow with the music, massage them, treat them like a human being. So their meat was so tender, the best. Oh, I'm not saying that we should eat Kobe beef, but I'm just saying that I love gardening and I talk to my plants. Yeah, and I don't know, I also see a lot of junk movies, but there's one movie called A Good Year. It's about the vine, and there's one of the person taking care of the vine, actually, he sings to the grapes, the vine. So I do think that nature is, as Genesis say, that the God created nature and delegated human to taking care of, but we really fail to taking care of right at the beginning, I guess. And I don't know if there is a solution, but I think maybe there's a way to resolve, but I don't want to be very pessimistic, but I also thought how was the gap, how we're going to chasing that to fix it. Yeah. And then most wealthy people now don't talk about social justice because they are talking about go to the space. So this is actually trouble. I hope I didn't invent too much.
Connie, Drew?
This is the place to vent. This is Hyde Park in San Diego.
I mean, the thing is that people, again, like I said, we respond with emotional stories. We also tend to respond to the things we see close by. Things like climate change sound very far away, and so we don't worry about it if it's not polluting our neighborhood. Now, if you're wealthy and you're in a nice neighborhood and you're not in some poor neighborhood where there's all sorts of pollution and dumping and so forth, and it's easy to just sort of say, well, I'm not going to worry about that. I'm not going to worry about something else. We tend to focus more on what's more immediate to us. It's really hard to do that. This is part of I think this is part of the issue about, some of the resistance to the vaccine is that you see, although you read about COVID, if you don't know people who've gotten sick, you think, well, that's just some far off thing. And someone's coming to you with a needle and that feels scary to people. I don't agree with that, but I'm unusual in that I can think statistically and so forth. Not everyone can do that. And so they look at what's really facing them right then and there.
It's not completely isolated. If you look at the whole structure of society we operate today, and the social justice does respond, or
Right.
environmental issue does cause the social injustice in some degree. But I just think the government, American, was the leader of the time. It's been a leader for a long time. But on the issue of environmental issue was still be fine.
Well, but again, because what happens is that we're told, but that's bad for the economy. They're bad for the economy today, and no one's thinking, well, what's going to be good for, is that going to be good for the economy 50 years from now? But it's bad for the economy today. That's why you had under the Trump administration, you had the rollback of all these things, because that was going to be good for economics and so forth. And there is a hidden cost. This is where it goes to the taxation of corporations. There's cost. It's just we've just diverted to the future. But people don't see that. They just look at, this short-term thinking.
I'd like to fancy myself as a bit of a scientist, but I have to say I'm losing faith in being able to present facts and persuade people. I haven't heard Lindsey Graham trying to tell his constituents that 92% of the people in South Carolina who are hospitalized were not vaccinated, and he got booed. It's like, but I am, I think the point about, stories and connecting with people, I think maybe Al Gore's film, Pearl Buck's The Good Earth. I know Jane Goodall is out there. Think of what To Kill a Mockingbird did, or the stories of, Uncle Tom's Cabin. And so if we can connect with people through stories or other narratives, I think that has a better chance of changing behavior than presenting them with facts. That's kind of where the position I'm in, so.
I would tend to agree, because like I said, I think people tend to think narratively and emotionally, not. Well, I mean, that's how people actually think. It's not how I think they ought to think, but it doesn't matter. That's how they actually do think. So I said, you have to deal with the fact that that's how people actually do think. It's not how I think they ought to think, but it is how they think. Yeah, the emotional thinking, that people think emotionally, they think narratively. That's how they process things. It's very hard to be able to look at cold hard facts and actually change your mind. People don't change their mind. They usually pick the facts that support their internal emotional narrative. That's when people say, oh, I'm going to go do quote research on the internet. What they do is they go and look for facts, things that support their narrative. You have to be really trained, and even when you're trained, you still have to be very diligent to say, no, I'm going to look for facts that actually challenge my narrative and see and make, and expose that.
I guess I'd like to take a broader picture of humanity and think that we're ready for different things at different times. So to say everybody, and I know you're not saying everybody, but to kind of give up, and you're not giving up, but to recognize that people that are at different places in their lives. And I think it doesn't hurt to put out that information. It can't hurt. And hopefully there's going to be that tipping point that we talk about, that people are going to say, yeah, the hope is that it's before it's too late. So with climate change, with the vaccine, with a lot of things, politically as well. We haven't even gone to that mountain yet. And all we can do is be true to ourselves and true to our faith. Maybe that's something to remember, that all we can do is control what we do in the world. And sometimes we're not, I know I'm not that good at that. But that's a start. It's the stone that's thrown into the water, and hopefully, the rippling effect will make a difference.
Right, and things can change. I mean, I'm sorry if I'm being this, but things can change. I mean, we can look at history. I mean, fascism was on the rise, almost a century ago, and it was resoundingly defeated. So democracy became more of an ideal. It's being challenged these days, but it became more of an ideal. So we certainly can change things. I'm not saying that we should just totally give up, but once just trying to put out facts there alone won't be it. We have to think about how we're going, deal with the narrative.
I'm just reminded of the, consistent with your point about the internet, there was a New Yorker cartoon recently where a woman says, I can't wait until 5 o'clock when I can switch from looking at the internet related to work to, to switch to the internet that's not work related. And so I think we do need to sort of, I mean, the social media is causing a lot of problems, as you know, but somehow be a force for good in the social media. I think because the social networking is there and people will still use that medium, that tool, as Diane would say, and to push back by somebody more familiar with social media than I am.
Is there any questions online? Does anyone on Zoom have any questions or comments to either say aloud or put in the chat? Okay, well, we're filling up space. I will give a pitch for a novel. A novel that's actually fairly hopeful about climate change. It's by the science fiction author Kim Stanley Robinson, and the novel is called The Ministry for the Future. Stan Robinson was one of my mentors in science fiction, but I think of it. We both read the novel. I call it the anti-Ayn Rand novel, because as opposed to being all about individualism, it actually is about communal behavior and so forth. And he actually pulls off long didactic speeches, but actually makes them kind of work and interesting, much more so than I would have thought possible. So the Kim Stanley Robinson Ministry for the Future, it has a vision for us going through the climate crisis and actually solving it, without making it, all just ponies and rainbows and everything.
You have to give a forum on that.
Yeah. Carolyn?
Yeah. Okay. Could you just put the title on somebody in the chat for me to write down, or say it again? I got the author.
Kim Stanley Robinson,
Uh-huh.
The Ministry for the Future.
Okay. Okay.
And I think one of my assistants are typing it into the chat right now.
I also wanted to just pick up the need, I guess, or the value of community versus individualism. That's how we're going to save this planet. Forgot the other thing, but that was one of them. I'll come back. Yeah, I just think that's so important. Oh, I know. Way back when we were in seminary, Richard's fieldwork parish in Washington, D.C. So this would have been 63, 64. Here again, calling back to how you started. The rector said the church exists to make the secular sacred. So that's always stuck with me too. Okay, that's it. And I don't know how to rename myself on this system, so I'm still Richard. Anyway, thank you.
Sue Kelly, I guess. Sorry, I have to crane my head so I can't actually see.
It's not me. I didn't say anything.
Okay.
But good morning.
You're welcome to say something if you want. Okay, so we've dealt with climate change. It's still about 20 minutes. What other topics would people like to talk about?
Just to follow on, Diane said that Ministry for the Future is available through the public library. She's on the wait list, so that's a good sign that it's that popular. What? It's waiting for her. So
Okay.
get on the way, read fast, get on the wait list. Yeah, about that book, what's nice is
it's like a tangible near future that you could touch. That's, as in, what would it look like if we started making some efforts? And, that's kind of a nice place literarily to spend some time. So, any other?
Particularly if it has to do with hope, I think, people kind of tend to run away from gloom and doom. Oh, sorry. I think particularly if it conveys a message of hope, hope is the thing with feathers, Emily, that perches in the soul, as Emily Dickinson would say. Because if it's all doom and gloom, people are just going to run away. So I think if there's a message of hope, which we're obligated to try to pass on, I think that's all the more valuable.
What else are people feeling anxious about? There's stories in the news they want to talk about.
One more brief announcement.
Sure.
Tonight, and this is something that might be of interest to this audience as well. Sacred Ground in Action will have another town hall meeting. Were you going to talk about that?
But it is a good thing, but please do, because it's definitely relevant too.
Okay, at 6 o'clock on Zoom. It's going to be on health disparities in maybe the area as well as the country, so in the world, I think. But anyway, hope you will listen. It'll be a lively conversation with a wonderful speaker.
Yeah, they're always very stimulating. So, these are another set of issues that we're trying to deal with is these, social and strife and the racial and economic disparities that we're facing in our country and many other places. So you guys have no anxieties in your life whatsoever.
Everybody's reactions. Excuse me. Recently, when Dean Penny asked us all to turn to somebody and ask them to express their imperfections, a younger woman who was behind me, 30, 35 or something, she said, well, I think I'm imperfect because I'm terrified of getting COVID. And I said to her, well, I think you're human, and remember that God loves you. But is there any way we could be addressing people in general to reassure them that all is not lost, at least as regards COVID?
Sure. I mean, it is interesting to sort of see various responses. Some people are very, very terrified and, being extra cautious, and often for good reason. They may have underlying health issues that make them feel vulnerable and so forth. Again, we have to think about whether we want to respond to that emotional narrative or just, statistics. I mean, statistically, about 1 in 500 Americans have died of COVID. On one hand, that's actually a very large number. On the other hand, it's 1 in 500. So, where it's not the Black Plague where 1 in 3 are going to die. That's not to minimize the dangers of COVID and so forth, because it has tremendous economic damages. So I don't have, Barbara, this is more your wheelhouses.
Well, I'm really struck by that, but I think the point that's worth making is that we're all going to have events that happen in our lives that we can't control, but there are things we can do to control it. I mean, I think maybe I'm making a mistake of emphasizing the facts again, but being vaccinated, wearing masks, the messages that Dr. Fauci has repeatedly said can really be very protective. I mean, it's 99.1% protective. So I think it's, again, dealing with this. I can understand people feeling that they don't have control, but, therapeutically, you point out the things that you can do. I mean, I think this virus is defeatable. I mean, the vaccine is really a miracle. I don't know if you've heard the story of the woman who developed the vaccine. I just share it because it's such I think, a powerful narrative. She was in Hungary. She was lived in Hungary. She just happened to really like science and biology, but she couldn't get good training. So she came to the United States in Philadelphia, and she couldn't get grants. There was a grant she applied for where there were 7 applicants and 6 people got funded. She was the one that didn't get funded. And but she happened to be standing next to somebody at the Xerox machine back in the days when, well, I should say copying machine. I'm from Rochester, New York, so Xeroxes. And they collaborated and they came up with this, putting the generating the messenger RNA, and they put a cap on it, and she knew it was going to work. So when they called her to say this is remarkably effective, she goes, I know. So you can change your environment, and you can, there are actions that do pay off, though I think there are times where it doesn't seem like it. And I go back to Anne Lamont's book, when you're in a dark place, do the right thing, put one foot in front of the other, and then the dawn will come. And I think that's true of whether it's, the COVID, you take reasonable, good precautions, and you do what you can to help save the environment, and maybe that is contagious. I mean, it's like Johnny Appleseed throwing out a seed, and it can help generate other.
I thought it was interesting that although this young woman said she was terrified of COVID, she was here with us.
Yes.
She wasn't terrified enough to stay away from a gathering. There's some comfort to her in being with us.
Well, the other thing I was going to say, others not directly answering that, but some of the things I sort of see, which is like, God doesn't want us, the so-called religious exemptions, which as far as I can tell are just mostly made up. But I did see something on Nextdoor, our local Facebook equivalent, just like, well, I don't want, God doesn't want us to live in fear, so I'm not going to live in fear, but my response is, well, we actually developed the vaccine in a miraculous time. How do you know that wasn't God's giving us a miracle? It's the miracle of science, but who says that God can't work through science? It's like the old story, I'm sure this, about the person stuck in a flood, stuck on that roof. They said, please God, deliver me. And the boat comes by, and the plane comes by, and the log goes by, and eventually the person drowns and goes to heaven. And they say, why didn't you, God, I prayed to you. And God said, I sent you a boat and a plane and a log, and you didn't take any of them. What else could I do?
And ironically, I remember that, remember Trump was saying the only way to defeat this virus is to develop a vaccine. And he did throw money at it, So these people who, that's sort of like Pharaoh. Sometimes people work for God's purposes, though they meant as tools as opposed to sons. So there are other forces that can be a force for good, even though they don't recognize it.
And now we have to be very careful about getting our science right, otherwise we'll have a correction about our virology. Since Susan, we were talking about COVID and so forth. So hopefully we weren't misrepresenting the science too much. What else would people like to talk about? What current events are on your mind?
When we had the high temperatures in the Pacific Northwest a few months ago, everybody was shocked. That 115, 116 degrees there, the last place you would think it would happen. And I have to say that even though I've been keeping up on climate change for many years, I was absolutely shocked, and I almost felt paralyzed. It was like, you put 2 and 2 together, And you say, if this continues, there's going to be food shortages, water shortages, energy shortages, with no water, we depend on water. And then a thought occurred to me, what did the prophets do in the Old Testament when God said, you're going to be invaded, and Jeremiah was supposed to tell the people, get ready for a really bad future. And of course, he was beaten up and jailed and all this other stuff. They didn't like the message. But then I thought, how did they keep their faith? How did they know that there was going to be a catastrophe coming? And how did they keep their faith in God and be steady through it all? I mean, he himself was carried off by the invading army. So it's not like he could avoid it. He was part of the group that had to be exiled and people were killed and all this other stuff. So I just wondered, how do we keep our faith? We can see what's on the horizon. I'm terrified for my children and grandchildren and all children and grandchildren. 75% of young people are depressed about it. They're very, very worried. And then we as adults have to try to give them some hope, and say, okay, there are things coming up like in Peru, fog catchers. They've created thousands of bottles of water with a non-industrialized contraption that catches, they said, clean water from the fog. There are the water generators that get water out of air. There was just an article in the news the other day, and people are coming up with interesting and creative ways to deal with certain problems that will be coming up. But I just wondered, our faith, how do we hang on to God and say, okay, God, though everything around me is going to be different, the life is not going to end, but our way of life is going to change. So I don't know how to, have faith for myself. I'm working on it, wrestling with it, and then give faith to the young people and say, you know what, it's going to be okay.
I was struck by the comment in the Women's Together talk the other night. And the speaker was citing Mark Trotter, who's, just the wonderful Methodist minister that says, God will be with you in the dark places, in the low points. I mean, which is a point that's really, illustrated in Jeremiah and the Psalms. And I think, reading the Psalms, at least for me, has been very inspirational in terms of the idea that God will be with us in the low points.
One thing we touched on a few minutes ago was about how we depend on community in our families, and rather than ourselves sometimes. And in response to you, what helps with keeping our faith is our community, our faith community. So, reach out to them, to us. And sometimes you find that you'll get help, maybe not immediately, but later on.
Also, I was going to say that faith is not the opposite of doubt. That faith is sometimes keeping it on even in the face of doubt and concern and not knowing, but saying, well, I'm going to stick with it anyway.
Yesterday, I was at a retreat, a Zoom retreat on Howard Thurman, which was just wonderful. But the one of the ideas was to do something, to know what you're called to do, to discern, to give yourself the time and space to figure it out, whether that's meditation or just walks along the ocean or whatever. We can't do everything. We can do something. So when you said, Barbara referred to the Anne Lamott book, you were in a dark place. 1 foot before the other means you have to start walking. to get to the light, right? So community is our valuable tool to listen, to strengthen each other, to pray together, it seems to me, and then to do something. Do something.
I just wanted to echo that point about doubt. As Tennyson said, believe me, there's more faith and honest doubt than in half the creeds.
We need to be, we're almost out of time. So any final thoughts from everyone? I mean, I would certainly agree that community and communication are key. This is what I always, when my students sometimes express, concern about, like, my family, blah, blah, they're so different from me and so forth. That's why I try to tell them is find some way that you can be together. Find some activity you can do together, even if you have different political views. By finding that common ground, it takes the edge off of that. And you're more willing to at least accept that the other person, even if you don't agree with them, is a reasonable person and is not just some cartoonish monster kind of thing. So I agree that we need to find community, not only within ourselves, but also people who disagree with us. We need to find a way to do that. Barbara, what are your final thoughts?
That's well put. I can't supersede that.
All right. Well, thank you all for participating. Hopefully this helped us air things and